Welcome back to Chase and Tails Outdoor Podcast, guys. My name is Walt, and I am joined by Chase, my co-host. Dude, we are sitting very close to deer season. I feel like this is one of those episodes that's really going to get people, if you're not already feeling the twang of pain that where you're close to deer season, but you're not quite there. I think this guy's going to send you over the edge.
Yes, he is. I mean, as of right now, I'm sitting 16 days from deer season.
Yeah.
And everything, I mean, I kind of feel behind a little bit now because he kind of talks a little bit of like late summer scouting, early season tactics. So, but yeah, it was a great conversation with him. And I think that he put everything out on the table. He wants people to be successful, and I think it'll kind of be reflected in this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. I'm glad that we were able to link up with Jake and talk to him about his tactics, because the dude gets it done. He gets it done on public land, and he shoots really, really large deer. So I'm going to let him tell his story because he does a far better job than I could ever do. But we got a couple announcements here. We've got some new patrons that we need to say thanks to. So huge shout out to Charles Headland and Steve Whittam for joining the podcast here recently. Appreciate you guys supporting the show. It means the world every time one of you guys signs up, and we'll get hats out and stickers out to the people who need them. And I also can announce that the giveaway item for this quarter is shipped. It is coming to the house. We've got 3. Now, originally we told you guys we're going to do 3 20-inch sticks, but be that as it may, we love you guys so much. We're doing 3 of the 24-inch sticks with aiders. We're going all out for you guys. This is a $400 and something giveaway that we're doing just to say thanks to you guys. Huge shout out to Timber Ninja Outdoors for helping us with that. We love you guys. They're good people. Listen to their episode. But if you like this podcast and you'd like to support what we're doing, we do 4 giveaways a year. And right now you can still get in on the Timber Ninja giveaway that we're about to do. Anything else you want to add before we kick it to the star of the show?
No, man. I mean, hunting seasons are upon us, so I just want to wish everybody good luck this season before everything gets kicked off, and I forget to mention that. So I can't wait to see all the slammers that get killed from people that have listened to our podcast. So if you have success this year, I think just tag us in your post, and we'll be willing to post them on our stuff.
Absolutely, we'd be glad. We would be over the moon to share people's success and broadcast it. That's what we're about, Chase and Tails. So that's a great closer there, buddy.
All right. Well, let's get on to the episode with Mr. Jake.
All right. Let's do it. All right, guys. We are on the phone with Jake Bush, the dude that just gets it done in one of the heaviest hit states in the Midwest. It's the state you always know about. There's 100 articles probably written about this state every year for non-resident and resident hunters. We're talking about the state of Ohio. We're talking summer scouting. Jake, man, I believe right now you are actively putting together gear for this upcoming season.
Yes, sir, I am. I'm actually in the process of putting the studs in my custom gear double sticks right now.
That's awesome, man. So mobile rigs have been a big deal this year. I'm curious, what is your setup going into this year?
So my setup this year, I refined it a little bit from last year again. It's going to be a custom gear DS5 for my stand, and I'll have the custom gear doubles and the minis. As of right now, my plan is to go with the doubles because I'm pretty confident with them at this point, and I'll actually be sitting in a saddle in that DS5 so I can turn around and kind of saddle hunt with it as well.
Wow.
Just to try to cover all aspects.
That is the first time I've heard of that, dude. That's nuts.
Yeah, it's it actually helps quite a bit, especially like early season. There's a couple of different places that I have a couple different bedding locations they can come off these ridges, and being able to turn around the tree like that just does wonders.
Oh yeah, I mean it makes sense. I mean that's smart, man. That's the benefit of both worlds there. So your saddle is basically your safety harness, and then you've got the benefit of having the platform and the tree stand there. That's cool, dude. There's 1,000 people right now that are either on one side or the other of that argument, and you just totally threw them for a loop.
Yep, yeah, right down the middle. Yeah, I've got my Phantom saddle, and like I said, it really does wonders. I mean, just setting up with it, and the DS5 platform's a lot smaller anyways, and it makes so much sense to be able to stand up and turn around a little bit for me.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I could see that. So, do you tinker with your gear heavily every year, or are you kind of one of those guys that waits for something landmark to happen before you start changing stuff?
I'm always refining it, to be honest. Throughout the seasons, I've noticed like I'll have a little squeak from something, or I'll put a stick up and it'll make noise where I didn't want it to make noise. Or there's just always little things to refine. I mess around with my attachment methods for my sticks quite a bit, just trying to refine that as much as possible. This year, I've switched again just because with the doubles, my plan is to have them attached to my saddle on the way up, and the scissor hauler will actually hold my straps for me. And as I climb, I can take one out and then attach the stick and climb up. And I'm just trying to refine that process as much as possible. And I feel like every year it gets a little better. But yeah, it's just a constant evolution is the big part.
That's awesome, man. I've never heard of such a blend. This is awesome.
Hey, whatever gets it done, man.
Hey, yeah. I mean, I can't argue with you. I mean, listen, anytime you're talking to a dude that shoots bucks as big as you are, I'm in no position whatsoever to even begin to try and judge what you're doing. I mean,
Yeah, well, that comes with moving to Ohio too. That's a big part of that.
oh,
So.
no. I mean, you hail from the Northeast, right?
Yeah, yep. I'm from New York originally, and last year, I don't know if you quite heard the whole story or not, but on a whim, I sold my home and quit my job, and I moved down here to chase big bucks. So I found a job on 12-hour shifts, so I have more days off, and I rent a 600 square foot apartment. I actually just bought a house, but until I get in the house, I'm still in my little apartment, and I just go out and chase big bucks all the time, man.
That's Chase's lifestyle, man.
Yeah, it's a little wild, but
So is the solo mean that are you a single man as well?
yeah, that single,
Okay.
and so I just have all the time in the world to do this right now, so I'm just taking advantage of it.
So the Instagram name's perfect.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
That's cool.
That's
man.
awesome.
I didn't know you had a little advertisement there for the ladies in your Instagram bio.
There we go. I didn't even think about that either, but oh, that's funny.
Oh man, well maybe one of the ladies listening to this in Ohio can be your mobile hunting partner. Well, that'd be a heck of a story, wouldn't it?
Yeah, there we go. We'll work on that.
Oh man. Well, Jake, today's topic is going to be predominantly how you approach the last part of summer and the earliest part of fall. And I think this is an area that, at least the early part of the fall, is becoming a little more popular as a
Yep.
way to go after big deer. I think there's a lot of information put out there, and I think a lot of times it's from people that maybe have kind of started to have that success, but they haven't really, hit it big yet. And you're one of those guys that I've heard your goals for this upcoming year. I think you're targeting Boone and Crockett bucks on public land this year, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So you're talking about a dude that gets it done, but is also swinging for the fences every time. And I couldn't think of a better person to start to pick your brain a little bit, man, and maybe help some people, because we get a lot of questions about this time of year. So for the listener, what are you doing late summer from a scouting standpoint?
So late summer, I mean, it kind of rolls throughout the full year for me. So just to back it up for a quick second, I'm really, leading into the year. So in the springtime, I'm finding a lot of beds. I'm going out and I'm not necessarily looking for too much sign, but I am looking for specific buck beds based on what the factors that are going to, make them bed there. So for hill country, it's going to be like leeward points on ridges, and preferably in the upper third, but I've found them lower as well. And I'm just marking down all these beds. I'm finding, food sources that are nearby, whether it's private ag fields, public ag, or oak trees, apple trees. I found a little bit of everything. And I'm just really, that time of year, I'm dialing it in. So when I start going into summertime, I basically got all the bedding locations down already. So I know where the deer are going to bed for that specific wind on that day for the majority of these areas. And at this point, all I have to do is locate a deer that I want to kill. If I can locate that deer, there's a very good possibility that he's in the beds that I've already found. And that's what I base my early season off. And that's, I believe, why I have so much success is I already have a lot of these areas scoped out up to that point. So leading into the summertime, I'm doing a lot of glassing, driving around to a lot of these locations. A lot of these drives are like, an hour, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, but I just have the time to be able to do that. I spend a lot of time doing that. I spend a lot of time running cameras. I ran 21 cameras this year on public. And as of right now, I've checked all of them but 2. So I have a couple different ways to try to take inventory of these deer. If I hear a rumor as well from somebody else about seeing a big one, I'll investigate it. And I'm constantly trying to just locate the most amount of big deer I can so I can be overly aggressive going into season. And I think that's a big part of it. If I only have, say that I have one deer located that I want to kill, I don't feel like I could probably be quite as aggressive on that because I don't have a backup plan. But I have so many backup plans that I swing for the fences every single time I go out. So yeah, leading into summer for me, it's more of an inventory standpoint. When I'm checking cameras, I am checking for early rubs. Last year, so the story on this 186-inch deer, last year I went in to put a camera up. It was the second week of September, just about the second week of September. And when I was walking those ridges to hang a camera, I found a huge rub. I posted it on Instagram. I mean, it was fresh like that day or the day before. That's what led me to that deer. That led me to a scrape, to his bed and everything. And I had a plan in mind to kill him 2 weeks later. And we can get more into that later. But so everything I do, I'm constantly asking, I see a big buck somewhere. Why did I see him there? What bed is he in? What was the wind doing that day? All my trail camera photos that I'm taking right now, I put on my laptop and I actually get on Wonderground. And for every picture that I have of a buck that's over 150 inches, I'll get the specific wind and weather conditions for that day and I'll log it. And I'll start putting these pieces together. So say that I have a buck that comes down to a private bean field, I'm intercepting him on the public and he comes down at 6 o'clock in the afternoon right now. And I have bedding locations set up for a southwest wind there. And I get him on that camera that day and it was a southwest wind. I know what bed he was in. I have at least a specific area. Sometimes that can be 8 to 10 beds within a 100-yard area, but I know within 100 yards where that deer's at. And I think that that's a big piece of early season success is being able to locate that, because then you can really push the boundaries on these deer and you can be a lot more aggressive.
How much of that, or I was going to say, how much like boots on the ground are you doing in the summertime leading up to the hunt to find these beds that you're talking about? Or do you just already know these beds?
So that's situational. This year is a little bit different for me because I have a lot of intel from last year and from the spring. Last year I moved here in June. So I had June, July, and August, and I probably put on, I would say 250 to 300 miles of actual hiking, searching for beds all summer. Yeah, every day I had off after work. I mean, every opportunity I had, I was out there locating beds. And to be honest, I mean, it's kind of nice to locate the beds in the summertime more if you have the option, just because you can see what's fresh time and you can really get a gauge on where the deer are at. Like this year, a lot of my really big wood stuff isn't nearly as good as it was last year because we don't have as many acorns. And so it's also fine tuning food sources as well. Some of the cornfields I targeted last year that were private, that I was intercepting these deer from the public, are beans this year, are hay fields. And so it's constantly evolving. The whole process is evolving.
So I'm curious. You said you sometimes prefer to find summer beds or beds in the summer. Do you feel like they use the same beds year round? Because it seems like the information I've seen in the past is that you need to find those beds in January, February, because those are the beds that they're going to be using the next fall.
I feel like they do. It depends. Once again, it's situational on food sources, because if you don't have, like, say you have a really bad acorn year and you don't have any public or private ag fields nearby, those deer might migrate quite a bit.
Gotcha.
But from the majority of my experience, the beds that I find are so hammered because I'm basically targeting the predominant wind. So say that we normally in Ohio get a southwest wind for the most part. Most of the bedding locations I'm looking for are on a southwest wind, and regardless of what time of year I find them, they're hammered. I mean, they're beat down into the ground. The leaves are crumbled up. There's 1,000 pieces of stomach hair in there. They're very obvious to me. So I think that it doesn't really matter what time of year you find them necessarily, but if you were targeting a new area, it might be easier to find them in the summertime.
200 plus miles between June and September. At what point did you start worrying, or did you at all start to worry about your human presence in the woods?
I don't worry about that whatsoever, to be honest with you. At least in Ohio, all of the public down here is just littered with hiking trails and horse trails and everything like that. So there's constantly human presence in there. And these deer get bumped around a lot more than everybody thinks they do. If most of these hiking trails are on top of the ridges, right?
Right.
So the wind is constantly blowing down the points of these ridges, and these deer are always getting wind bumped. And I've witnessed it multiple times myself where, there will be hikers up top and the deer don't bust out of there like crazy. They get up and they just go over to the next ridge and bed down in another location. And you can kind of track that. And so they're constantly getting bumped. I mean, I don't worry about ground scent whatsoever. I play the wind. I don't worry about any scent control at all, because if you're hiking in 1.5 miles, 2 miles early season, you're going to be so sweaty, you don't stand a chance. So I play the wind with milkweed and I try to put myself in the best situation possible. But I mean, I'm actually after a 170-inch deer this year. He's going to be probably right at that 170 as an 11 point. And I've bumped him out of his bed 4 or 5 times, whether it was turkey hunting. I saw the exact same deer. I found multiple sheds of his on public. He's locked down to this location. I can't bump him enough to get him out of there. And I've experienced that 3 or 4 times already down here where, I might have a camera way back over a ridge, and to cross that ridge, I keep bumping the same 140-inch deer out over and over and over. I would talk to Byron about that. I bumped the same deer out 3 days in a row off the exact same bed.
Wow.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. If you're bumping him out and he's getting away every time, then he probably feels like that's a good bed to be in.
Yes, he feels safe with it. And like I said, they're so used to getting bumped. I mean, almost every public ridge in Ohio has some sort of trail on top of it. So they're so used to that human presence.
So it sounds like you hunt a lot of big woods then. If from just what you're saying, is that true?
Yeah, I prefer the big woods. It's to me, it gets less pressure. There is a lot of public ag lands around here, and that seems to get a lot more pressure. And I've noticed the quality of deer isn't quite the same as it is in the big woods. If you get down in southern Ohio in the hills, I mean, I've got cameras this year that have 5 bucks over 150 on one camera in daylight, 5 totally different deer. And they're coming to a community scrape at 3:00 in the afternoon in June. I mean, the big woods seem to hold bigger deer, and that's why I gravitate towards those areas.
Interesting. That it does make sense though. I bet you that there's not a whole lot of non-resident hunters that are like, you know what I'm going to do when I get out of the deep south? I'm going to go get into those big woods again. Because that's what we have here. Is I feel like in listening to you, I kind of relate to a lot of what you say. And a lot of these big wood hunters that I've heard here lately, it seems like there's, we don't necessarily have quote unquote big woods here, but we don't have ag. And it seems like the patterns are kind of similar along those lines, because there's no big, it makes sense what you said about the lack of agriculture. If there's not a huge draw short-term food source that's only available for a short period of time, their patterns and their ranges are probably pretty similar year-round.
Exactly. And to kind of just run off what you were saying there, I mean, you got to think, so east of Ohio, most of those states in the Northeast or the East or even the South are wooded and they're hills, right? I mean, that's kind of that. So people that come to Ohio or come to the Midwest to hunt, especially non-residents, kind of have that Midwestern dream in their mind. They want to come out, they want to hunt ag lands, they want to hunt these big, funnels alongside ag fields that are public for the rut and stuff like that. So those are what really get targeted. I mean, I don't see, there's absolutely zero pressure bow hunting in Southern Ohio. If you ask me on public, I don't physically see anybody.
What does your truck look like?
It is.
Hey, I'm all for it, man. I love guys coming up here
No.
and
Yeah.
killing big deer.
Yeah, no, that's not what you hear though. You never hear someone say, I seldom see people in public in Ohio, or most places you don't hear that. But I'm curious if there's not a huge shift in how their patterns change. How long is the information and the intel that you get in the summer? How long is that actionable data for you?
So there's a lot of that once again, there's a lot of variables to that. I do have locations where I have deer that like that big 11 point I'm after this year. He will not leave that ridge system. He's there all year. You know, he summers there, he winters there, he drops his sheds there. He's always there because there's food sources nearby. And if you're in extremely big timber, I think that that's going to change a lot more. But if you have a consistent food source, whether it's a really good oak flat every year or some sort of ag, they're going to be a lot more consistent, and you can use those to your advantage. And that's what I've took all those miles that I've walked and scouted, and all these, I mean, I've scouted hundreds of thousands of acres of public land, and I've narrowed that down to 20 camera locations. And from those 20 camera locations, I narrowed that down to my first, let's say, 5 or 6 sits of the season that are just, to me, home runs, high percentage sits on giant deer. So it's all just a matter of filtering all that down, and you're trying to put yourself in the best situation with those spots that are more consistent. I have spots that aren't consistent that I really won't target as much because I can't keep that consistency there, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned cameras there. Let's touch on that for a second. You run 20 cameras, it sounds like. Um,
Yeah.
what how do you utilize cameras? Because there's guys that go in and check it every couple hunts. There's guys that leave it for long soaks. What does your trail camera strategy look like?
So my camera strategy is I'll put my cameras out in June, and normally I'll pull them in September, like 2 weeks before season. I'll pull them and I'll have all that intel. This year I leave for Montana next Friday for an elk trip for 2 weeks, so I had to pull them early. So this year I'm losing like 20 days, basically 3 weeks of intel that I wish I had, but I can't physically pull all those cameras in 3 or 4 days before season. It's too much workload. There's too much driving. I mean, that's hundreds of miles of driving to get to all these different cameras. So for me, all it is an inventory purpose. And then I let them sit when I pull those cards for the rest of the hunting season, and I'll pull them and I'll have that historical data for the next year. So say that my brother wants to come down during the rut next year and his goal is 140-inch deer. Well, November 19th last year, I had 5 different cameras that had 140-inch deer on daylight for like 2 or 3 days consistently. So I have that data already that I could go throw them in, that saddle right there, or throw them on this bedding ridge that has a big logging cut on it. And he's got a really good chance of killing a deer.
Do you feel like your best chance of killing a really big deer is going to be early season?
I do. Yeah. I feel like for me, I've got my first 5 sits are home runs, and my first 5 sits are going to be on right at that Boone and Crockett class. Even 160s. Let's say that mid to high 160 deer. My first 5 sits are going to be on deer that are that size that I have really consistently either observed or I have them on camera, or I know that food source is such a draw right now, and nobody's back there that they're going to pull off their bed and come right down that ridge the right way. So yeah, I would say that my first 5 days are hands down, I mean, the best chance that I have. It's not even close.
And you're using wind basically are you using that as your determining factor on which spot you're going to hunt?
Wind is my biggest factor, but I do have some other factors as well. Last year, when I went in to kill my buck, I had a lot of locations that had good deer for a southwest wind. And the reason I went to that spot specifically was it was one of the last areas in the mountains that had water because we had a dry summer. So there was a creek, and that creek still had water in it. And I knew that from hanging that camera 2 weeks prior. So I knew that it was 94 degrees out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I killed him. And I believe that he was coming down to get water. He came down to the oak tree, and then I believe he was headed to the creek before I shot him. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. There's a lot of ridges that I have that are really steep, and the north side will be shaded all day as well. So now you have a shaded slope that's leeward. You have a lot of different factors for these deer to bed there, and just finding those locations really helps out.
How do you keep track of all this?
So I have notebooks. On Onyx, I log Onyx a lot different than probably most people do. I use the colored pins and everything like everybody, but a lot of these locations you can upload photos to a specific pin on Onyx. And so I'll upload, first off, trail cameras. I'll actually take a picture of the tree. I'll upload pictures of beds. I'll upload pictures of trees that I could potentially sit in. I'm just constantly logging all this data all the time.
Okay, yeah, because that's what I was wondering. I'm like, if you found all these beds and everything else, I'm like, how on earth is he remembering all this with it being spread out hundreds of miles? I'm like, there's got to be some way he's logging all this information.
There is. And another thing that I do as well, one of my biggest source of inventory, hands down, is cameras. And with cameras, what I'll do is I'll log the specific deer that I have on that camera for the wind of that day. So I can pull into my phone and say, okay, so say it's opening day here and I have a southwest wind. I'll actually open up my southwest wind folder and I'll have 4 or 5 bucks in there that were bedding on this ridge in a southwest wind. So right there, now I know I have 5 deer I can target on that wind. And that helps a lot because otherwise you can get that confused quite a bit.
Yeah, I'd say so. How are you setting these cameras up? Like, where are you putting these cameras to get pictures?
Yep. So I basically set the cameras for the most part. Like I have a lot of areas that are big clear cut areas as well, right? And so with the clear cut areas, I can find community scrapes more often. If I can, the majority of the spots that I'm putting cameras in have multiple different bedding ridges in close proximity. And so community scrapes are a big thing. If you can find those, a lot of times those deer will pull off those and hit those scrapes, they'll hit them at like 5 or 6 in the afternoon in the summertime. So you have really good pictures. I also put them on the trails. A lot of the trail. So in the big woods, what I've noticed is these bedding locations, the deer will leave those locations and head one direction. There's normally one trail they're heading out onto a food source. If you can find that trail, a lot of times it will have rubs on it. If you can find that trail and put a camera on it, you're going to have a lot of intel. And normally I'll put that camera at least one ridge over. So if I have the main ridge and there's a bunch of points that jut out and I know that this buck's bedded on this point, I'll try to have that camera on the next ridge out of sight of him, if that makes sense. So when he comes around that second point, my camera will be there. And that's also where I set up my tree stand because I could be within 75 to 85 yards of that deer and he never even knows I'm there.
If your idea is that these deer have about the same range year round and you're hanging these cameras for long soaks, when you set that camera out until midsummer, if you're not getting bucks, are you pulling that camera? How long are you willing to commit to that area to provide some variance in their ranges?
Be honest with you, I feel like I'm at the point with my scouting where I really don't put cameras where I'm not positive there's a buck bedded there, and that's based off. Normally, if you find these bedding locations that are wind based like that with big beds, or you find some rubs, there's going to be a buck there. It's just a matter of the size. And normally I'll validate that with like a footprint. If I can find a track that's, a 4-finger track, then that spot's getting a camera because I know that there's a mature deer in there. It's just a matter of how many inches he's got on his head at that point. And I would say that this year, so I pulled 18 cameras at this point, and every camera that I pulled has at least 140-inch deer on it, but I don't even log those. I've got, at this point, out of the 18 cameras, I've managed to find 13 bucks over 150. It might be 14. It's right on the verge of being 14. So I feel like the scouting's there. The scouting pays off, and my cameras really don't go dry very often, to be honest with you.
Interesting. Chase, I wonder if that could be scaled for Florida.
Yeah, I don't know because I really can't figure out where the bucks bed here on a consistent basis.
Is that more like flatland, or what kind of terrain are you at down there?
Yeah, it's flat, just flat. Like if I told you, hey, walk that ridge, it might be a foot high. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I got you. And that I struggle with that too, to be honest with you. That's why one of my big targets is big woods, because it just makes so much sense to me.
It'll be interesting because I hear these guys. You're not the first person to say this, that especially from a scientific standpoint, that a big buck's range is relatively small. Obviously there's some variance to that based on food proximity and the abundance of it. I'm not saying that everybody fits within a certain neat criteria, but when I think about Florida, I have some topography up here. I've got some areas where there are genuine, 15 to 20 foot elevation changes, which I know someone's listening and laughing right now when I say that. But for Florida, that's huge. Like, that's just unheard of. And I get these glimpses, or you hear about these big bucks that are seen, and it's one of those things where you can scatter cameras on trails here that look like they're just beat the hell down. And Chase, you and I have talked about this on and on, where these trails just look like you could just sit there, and if you dedicated 15 minutes, there just has to be a deer that comes down that trail. But there's so many different connecting routes, and the land is so homogeneous. I mean, it's just almost equal cover all the way across. There doesn't seem to be any kind of pattern. But I want to be the guy that figures out how to do it, because it seems like in everywhere else people are able to find some pattern. It just doesn't seem like Chase and I are able to connect the dots sometimes.
I feel like, I mean, if you can physically put enough miles on the ground where you're locating the specific beds and set your cameras up based on those beds, and if you can find those beds and then find some sort of food source, like what would you think the first food source would be, leaving that bed, and then just cut that off with a camera, that might put you a lot more in the game. I know that even here, there's some trails that are beat down that you get in certain areas, and I mean, there's just trails coming from everywhere, and it's just, at that point, it's a guessing game. You might be at 5% success rate on getting a buck on camera or something like that.
Right. See, the problem is, at least for me, is just finding buck beds, because I feel like they can bed anywhere because of the amount of cover that's down here. And there's really, like Walter kind of mentioned, there's like no necessarily defined food source. I mean, it stays green down here all season long. So there's plenty of browse for them. If you've got a bumper acorn crop, then they can pretty much choose any tree they want to go to.
Yeah.
Or it either seems like we have no acorns, or we have like a bumper crop of acorns that year. So it's kind of, that's what kind of makes it difficult for me, is what you're saying is I'm trying to, like, okay, how can I apply this down here? And I'm sure there's some way I can apply it down here. It's just maybe more of, I've just got to go bust through a bunch of areas that are just thick and find these beds that you're talking about.
Yeah. That's probably how I would attack it, to be honest.
Well, and it also sounds like, and Chase, your situation is a little bit different than Jake's, because you hunt, a fair amount of private land, and that's where your big deer are. You don't necessarily want to push them off that private land. But you do hunt your fair share of public, and it sounds like, Chase, maybe you and I, our mark for success is when we're doing our scouting, maybe if we're not bumping those big deer out of their beds, maybe that's the indicator. If we put on our hip waders and we bust through the brush and we start bumping up big deer, maybe stopping and being like, okay, well, what kind of terrain, or not terrain, but what kind of brush is this, and see if there isn't some kind of pattern amongst that. Maybe that's the missing link. I don't know.
Yeah, or we just need to get Florida to start planting a bunch of agriculture, so we can get them to go
one way or the other.
That's it. Okay, so how often do you identify during your summer hunting the buck that you're going to kill, or that you end up killing? Like, how often, you talked about how you try and find as many deer as you can of a certain caliber, but how often is the buck that you're going after one that you've laid eyes on more than once?
So the majority of the time, I believe I laid eyes on this deer last year. When I found that rub, I looked up and I bumped a giant deer. I can't verify for sure it was this deer, but there's a very good possibility it was. But the majority of the time, I do have inventory on that specific deer, whether it's a sighting or camera. This year, I have more camera intel, so I feel like I'll have a much better chance of actually having the deer that I'm going to kill on camera already. But yeah, normally I have some sort of observation of that specific deer, and I always have an observation of deer that I want to kill in that area when I've actually killed, obviously, or I wouldn't be there.
Yeah. I was curious. I remember you mentioning on another podcast, your ability to target these deer. But sometimes it sounds like these, hunters will find an area that holds big bucks, and it's another buck that tips you off to this is a good area, and you end up killing one you don't see. But it sounds like you pretty well know. Do you name them? Are you a
No,
deer
I don't.
namer? No.
No, I don't name them. And I didn't. So when I checked my camera going into hunt last year, I didn't have that buck that I killed on camera, but I did have 150 some inch 10-point on camera. And first year in Ohio, I was thrilled. I was like, oh, I'm going to kill this deer. Like I've got him locked down. And then this thing came off the ridge instead. And I was just, you can imagine.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That's the kind of buck that literally every American hunter thinks about. I mean, it's stunning, dude. And we're going to get to that story. I'm going to make sure we keep time for that. So moving along, let's move. It's no longer summer scouting. It's now the first week of deer season. You've done all this cataloging. You've done all your Wonderground analysis. What are you doing those first 7 days that you aren't doing the rest of the year?
So my hunting strategy is a little bit different too. I really don't target mornings a whole lot just because I make a lot of noise, and I don't like going in with a headlamp. I like to know the specific tree I'm going to be in. My view on it is that if the deer goes back to his bed and he beds down, at that point, it's all in my hands. He's already laying down. As long as I can beat his ears and beat his nose and his eyes, I can kill that deer. I know in my head, sometimes I'm wrong, but in my head, I know exactly where that deer's bedded, like the specific bed. And I know that I'm going to scout my way in and find the best sign within 100 yards of that bed and set up on it and kill him. That's in my head what I'm thinking every time I go in. If I go in early in the morning at 2 a.m. and set up, now it's in his hands. If he J-hooks, he might bust me. But if I set up for a J-hook and he goes the other way and doesn't J-hook, I won't have a shot opportunity. And now I've left the fact that I was there. Like when he gets out of his bed, now he knows I was there. There's just a lot of factors that I like having everything in my hands. So I would say that, if as I get into the rut, I start morning hunting more because you're hunting travel routes at that point more, not specific beds. So the first, pretty much all of October, not necessarily the first 7 days, pretty much all of October, that's what I'm doing is hunting nights, targeting beds, trying to get as close as possible. And honestly, I mean, that time of year, every time I go in, I'm swinging for the fences. First off, it's fun to me that, like the thrill of either you're going to kill that deer or see him, or you're going to bust him off the ridge. If he's in that bed, which in my head, he always is in that bed, even though, like I said, I'm wrong sometimes. If I go in there and I do everything right, I can kill him. But if I go in there and I mess up, he's going to bust off that ridge. And that thrill to me is so much fun. But on the other side of that, you learn so much too. You go in and you do everything right, and he comes down and you shoot him at 25 yards at 3 p.m, you're done. You just accomplished that. But if you fail, you have all those lessons that you learned. Why did you fail? Did your thermals spin on you? Did the wind change and you didn't look at the forecast the right way? Was the north slope so shaded that your thermals didn't rise and you set up a little bit too high and that wind blew across his bed? There's so many factors, and I think that's a big part of it.
How close are you getting to these beds?
So normally I try to get, it's big woods, so it's a little bit different, but most of the big woods that I'm hunting are thicker, and that's why there's beds there as well. Whether it's briars or just a lot of stem count, whatever it is, old clear cuts that are nearby to some sort of food source. I would say on average, I'm probably getting, let's say 75 yards from a bed. I've been 200 yards from the beds knowingly, and I've also been 40 yards from beds in different locations. It really depends. I try to get to the hottest sign that I can find that correlates that bed to a food source. If that sign's on the other side, it might be made at night, but I'm trying to get to the sign that's in between him and the food source, and as close as I can. There's a lot of things that go into that. If you're in big country the whole time, you're throwing milkweed, trying to figure out what your thermals are doing. Like last year, I was probably, if I would have been 10 feet higher, 10 feet up the ridge further in another tree, I wouldn't have killed this deer because I had a just off thermal pole. it was shaded enough where with milkweed I could see, I had his specific bed locked down, and I could see that my milkweed was only probably 20 feet below where his bed was, blowing down through there. So there's a lot of variables that go into that, but yeah, I would say on average probably 75 yards.
That's still a foreign. That seems so incredibly close.
And it is. And
yeah.
So my setup is I'll go in at that's another reason why I don't really hunt mornings. I'll actually wake up, because I work nights. I'll wake up at 11 a.m., drive to where I want to be, get there. Let's say I get there at 12:30. And last year I got to the spot that I wanted to hunt at 11:30, I believe. And it took me 3.5 hours to hike 3/4 of a mile and set my stand up. And I was only in the stand for maybe 30, 35 minutes before I killed him. But that's how long of a process that takes, because every gust of wind you get, you'll take a couple steps and then you'll wait. You know that if in your head that deer's right there, you act totally different than if you're not sure too. That's why mentality is such a big part of it, because if I would have went in there and thought maybe there's a deer in this valley somewhere, I would have just trudged down through there and found some sign and set up, and he would have never came down off that ridge. So yeah, that's definitely a big part of it.
What's your? Go ahead, Jace.
No, I was just going to say 3 hours getting to your spot. That's some dedication right there.
Yeah, it's fun though, man. I'm telling you, it's a blast.
You may have to work on me a little bit on that sale, but yeah, you know what? Actually, I just looked at the photo again. I'm sold.
Yep.
I've taken a long time sometimes to approach some areas. Have you ever thought? I mean, what's the turkey population in the areas you hunt?
The turkey population isn't. I mean, there's turkeys there, but it's not like down south at all, or even up in. It's decent though. I mean, are you talking about calling on the way in?
Yeah, dude. Have you ever experimented with that?
I have a little bit, and I've actually spooked a lot of deer, and that's one thing. Maybe it's because I sound like a dying pig, but I mean that's. But yeah, I mean I've got away with it on some does before. I've spooked some bucks. Last year, I believe it was Zach Fehrenbaugh was talking about how they were hunting Ohio, and they came up over top of they ended up targeting big bowl systems, and during muzzleloader, they were pushing those, and they came up over top of one of the bowls, and they turkey called, and he said that 15 deer blew out of there like you couldn't imagine, and I'd rather not tip them off to anything.
Yeah, I can see that. I wonder. I'm glad you said that, because maybe this will change how I go about it. Hens and whatnot, they don't do a whole lot of calling in the fall per se, but I've always thought I got big into turkey hunting this spring, and I had a gobbler coming to me in the woods, and I was like, is that a gobbler or another hunter? For a moment there, it just sounded like a dude picking his feet up and dropping them and picking his feet up and dropping them. And I saw a deer one time years back. She kept watching some brush. And I didn't know what it was. And then I heard just a soft little, puck, puck, purr, puck, puck, purr. And the moment that noise happened, she dropped her ears and went back to eating it, and completely left everything alone. And I remember that, and I can't believe I never made the connection. But I was younger, and I thought, oh wow, that's cool. She knew that was a turkey, So I'm gonna try it this year, and I'll let you know how it works in the South. Maybe because we've got more turkeys, it's less frightening.
Yeah, and I'm sure sometimes it would work. I would have a lot of yeah. I just prefer to be quiet.
Yeah, because I feel like they can pick up, like we've talked about before, the exact location.
That's
exactly.
True. That's true.
Yeah, that's a big part of it for me.
Yeah.
So if you make some other weird noises, they're like, wait a second.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not a turkey.
Do you have a preference on a kind of tree you like to set up in? For the most part, no. I mean, I try to go in really open-minded. I obviously, yes, I would like to be in a basketball-sized tree that has a crotch 15 feet up that I can get just above.
Yeah.
In the perfect world, right?
Right.
But I've actually gotten situations where I've found that tree, and then I found another tree that's 10 yards, further down the ridge, and that's the tree I need to be in, and I sit in the wrong tree because of that. So I'm trying to get out of that mentality. I try to go in with a complete clean slate every time. From the moment I start walking, I'm looking for sign, and I'm trying to correlate that to the beds, and I try to get in the, normally for me, it's like, I mean, last year, same exact thing. And this happened to me multiple times. The specific tree that I get in is probably the only tree that I could have killed that deer out of. I just, whether it's total luck or what, I've got into the right tree. If I would have been in the other one, I would have been, 10 yards, either got blown out or I wouldn't have had the shot that I had when he turned broadside. It seems to work out like that for some reason. And I've picked the wrong one a lot, but.
Yeah. How do you go about judging that when you're walking in? I've tried to incorporate, like, I'm going to scout my way in till I find the fresh sign, and then I'm going to hunt. And a lot of times I end up passing the freshest sign in search of the freshest sign per se. You know where you're going to a large extent. How do you kind of like eyeball trees when you're in there scouting to begin with, and then you're coming back and just kind of verifying that?
I do a little bit, but I try to get away from that. So like I said earlier, all the scouting I do, I narrow all my spots down to put me in the best advantage possible with the biggest deer. So I have spots that do have giant deer as well, but they're going to be harder to hunt. And I don't target those as much for a specific reason. So most of mine, I try to put the food source that I want to go after downwind of the predominant wind for that bedding location. If I can find areas that, I would be coming in and accessing from either the food source, or I would be able to circle around to that food source and start working my way from the food source back to the bed. So every step that I take away from that food source is a step closer to the bed. So all of that sign is going to be a little bit earlier in the day.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. And I just keep going and keep going and keep going until I feel that I'm at a point where that deer would feel comfortable enough based on cover and based on everything else to get down and make it to that sign during the daytime. Oh, yeah. And then at that point, the tree would be the best tree for that specific location, which sometimes is a tree that's, 4 inches in diameter. Sometimes it's this giant tree where I have to use all 8 feet of my straps.
Right. Interesting.
Are you using,
go ahead.
I was wondering, are you using Onyx the whole time? Like, are you going, okay, these are where these beds are. I'm now within 100 yards. I'm within 50 yards.
Yeah, I'm constantly on Onyx, and I'm actually, while I'm walking in a lot of the times, I'm taking measurements as well. I'll use the tool for the measurement tool.
Clever.
And I'll keep saying, like, hey, because I have a distance in mind. If I can't get within 200 yards, it's pretty much pointless to me because I don't know if a 170-inch deer is going to want to get up, and, a 4 or 5-year-old deer is going to want to get up and move 200 yards in daylight.
Right.
So, yeah, Onyx is a huge tool for me.
Good deal. Well, I've exhausted all my questions. Chase, how about you?
Were you applying these tactics somewhere else before you started applying them in Ohio?
Yeah, yep. I hunted New York for pretty much my whole life. I got into some of these tactics quite early. I've just kind of refined them in my own style, and I've had really good luck up there. The problem in New York, like a lot of areas, is the deer just aren't as big. I mean, I've killed multiple 3, 4, 5-year-old deer, but the racks don't justify them at all. So it's a little different. Moving down here was definitely a big change for me with that aspect.
Sure.
Do you feel like hunting New York helped you when you went to Ohio?
I definitely do. And I think that's why I don't feel like there's a lot of pressure here, I think, is because New York is just hammered with pressure. The public land up there, in New York, basically everybody owns 20 acres, 10, 20 acres, something like that. So you only have these little chunks to hunt, and the deer don't do very many natural things, and they don't really live to be the, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old deer that you can see in the Midwest states. So yeah, it definitely helped me quite a bit. And I've got a lot better at avoiding pressure and recognizing little signs of pressure. And I think that's a big part of it.
Now, these bucks, obviously you see them. Did you see the buck that you killed get up out of his bed?
So I heard a stick crack because I was taking B-roll. I was messing around with my camera and manual like I shouldn't have been, of course, being dumb. But so I'm messing around with my camera and I hear a stick crack and I look up and I watched him stand up and he started working, which would have been to my east, which was bad because my thermals weren't rising. They were actually running almost straight down the ridge because that ridge was shaded. And I had like a 15-mile-an-hour wind. And so he actually went like I mean, when he stopped on the trail, he actually came right to me on the trail that I walked in on. He walked right down my boot tracks for 75 yards, right to an oak tree that was 33 yards. And he started eating the acorns that I verified were it was a white oak that had a scrape under it and a bunch of fresh rubs. And so within 75 yards of his bed, I found that. I was like, this is where I got to be. I have to be able to shoot this spot. And he came down and turned broadside. I mean, you couldn't have wrote it up any better.
And how early did he get up before dark?
It was October 2nd, I believe. I think it was the 2nd or the 3rd, one or the other. I believe it was the 2nd. And he was out of his bed at like 3:20 in the afternoon. And he was, it was 94 degrees out, 93, 94 degrees that day. I believe that he was getting up to eat some acorns and get some water. The water was within 110 yards of his bed, and I believe he was going to head back up and bed back down. And I just happened to be at that spot where he wanted to eat some white oaks on his way, and I just cut him off.
So you don't think he was headed to the main food source. You just think, oh, I'm going to get up, stretch my legs, grab something to eat real quick, grab some water, get some water, and then just go right back to his bed.
Yep, and that's exactly why I targeted that spot that day. Being so hot, it was one of the last creeks that still had water in it in the mountains.
So would you say that part of your tactics is trying to identify a food source that they'll hit? You mentioned the closest food source, but it kind of sounds like you're saying that there may be I don't want to say a less preferred, but like if there is a grove of oak trees with a bunch of sign underneath and just acorns going everywhere, but there's a smaller oak tree next to your bedding, do you think that it's habit for mature deer as a generalization to hit that smaller tree closer to their bed to prevent them having to get up and expose themselves?
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
That's perfect. And so I always have a major destination in mind, whether, like I said, it's egg or just a big oak flat. But I feel like there's always some sort of food source or water source that they want to hit before they get there. And if you can cut them off at that point, that's huge.
I haven't heard that before, but it kind of makes sense, right? Like if their whole goal is to stay as isolated as possible, they are going to get hungry. Chase, this is something we've talked about before when it comes to acorns. If they can find bedding next to a tree that's dropping acorns, they're never going anywhere, right? They don't have to expose themselves really. I wonder that it just seems. Never heard that said before, right? Like there might be like a pre-staging food source per se.
100%. I believe that there is. I've seen that a lot with these big deer. They seem to have everything figured out. And most guys, the way they hunt, they're too scared to get that close because they don't want to spook the deer, right? So they would never even be in the game of that first food source. If that buck goes down and feeds there, he might feed there. He might feel comfortable enough to feed at that food source until dark and then move out to the destination. If you're either A, sitting on the edge of the destination, or you're B, 200 or 300 yards from his bed, you're completely out of the game. You really have to push the limits. And I think that's a lot of guys really understand the concept of the beds and everything like that, but there's a lot of guys are really scared of failure. And for me, it's so fun for me. I have no fear of failure whatsoever with deer hunting because I have backup plans, and that's a big part of it. But even if I just feel like the closer you can get, the more you can push your limit of that, the better off you're going to be with every hunt. And I think you're going to see sightings go up and kills are going to go way up, especially once you fail a couple times and realize what you're doing wrong.
Now, do you feel like if you would have bumped that deer, that you would have been able to come back and hunt him a few days later?
Yes, I do. I think that in these locations, they get bumped around so much, like I was saying before, that they'll come back to that spot. And I mean, there's a lot of guys that actually capitalize on like the bump and dump tactic because of that. They'll bump these deer out, and they'll set up, and the next day or even that night they'll come in and kill them.
Right. Yeah, because I feel like you said there's a lot of guys that are and girls that are under the conception of if you bump a buck out, it's gone forever or whatever. He's gonna go bed somewhere else. I don't believe that. I don't. I go in and scout all the time and do things. Where either I'm checking a camera or something, trying to get recent intel, or just looking for the freshest sign available. And I really don't think that you're going to like just totally blow them out of an area. especially if they've always been there. I mean, you're talking about a mature buck. I don't know. How old was this deer? Was he 4.5, 5.5, you think?
We were estimating 5.5. I didn't actually get him aged, but I would say 5.5.
Okay, so 5.5. At that point, he's probably got his, like you mentioned, his routine dialed down.
Yeah.
And it's like older guys, like they've got their routine dialed down and they don't want to switch it.
Yeah.
And it's worked for him for so long. He's like, okay, this has always worked.
Yeah.
A big part of that is just I see, if I had like 30 acres or 50 acres of private land, I would approach it differently as well, because like you guys are saying, you really don't want to bump those deer off your land too many times. But
Right.
having just like vast public land where there's constantly people in there and there's just constant human presence, I feel like you can just get away with bumping them. It's totally different.
I mean, it does make sense, and I think if you're dealing with a 40,000 acre tract, you might bump them 30 off of that 30 acres, but you're not as confined. I think I could see, Chase. I can think of a couple WMAs off the top of my head that get a lot of pressure, that people pull pretty decent deer off of on a pretty frequent basis. That what Jake's saying would very easily apply. A lot of Florida public land is like open to horses, and there's an access road to every block of timber. Getting away from, quote unquote, away from people is very difficult in a lot of areas here. And I think I could see a world where what you're saying would really apply quickly. Let's tie this all together. You've got an incredible story, an incredible deer that you harvested last year. I mean, this thing is absolutely stunning. We've talked about a lot of tactics, and we've kind of touched on this story a little bit as well in this episode, but why don't you, I'll give you the floor and rudely interrupt periodically, I'm sure, but why don't you kind of tie all this together with how that hunt unfolded?
Yeah, yep, absolutely. So I kind of went through the moving down here and the summer scouting and everything. Last year I located a lot of good deer very quickly through cameras and some observations. One of my big tactics last year I really didn't mention a whole lot was actually physically bumping these deer off their beds on purpose. And that was coming in from the tops of these ridges. I just wanted to cover that because that's a good tactic as well. But so I located that there was some good deer in this one thermal hub. Basically, it was a location where the way that the ridges circled around, they could basically bed there on every wind but an east wind. And so there was a lot of really good buck sign there for that reason. It could always hold multiple deer. And when I found that spot, I just logged it like all my other spots that I had. And I had all those other factors in mind too. It was a really steep ridge. There was water there. The food source was really good at the time. It was full of white oaks in there. And so going into season, actually opening day, I didn't sit in big hill country at all. I sat in ag land because I had a bead on another good deer. And I didn't end up seeing that deer that night. I pushed in. I could have very well pushed in too close. I was probably 50 yards from this bed. I never ended up seeing him. And the next day I took off because I was so tired. It was like 90, it was almost 100 degrees that first day. So the next day I took off because I was just absolutely drained. I mean, I only took one bottle of water with me, and I took the next day off to recoup. It was kind of a little bit stormy out and everything. And the following day, I realized that I had to get out there again. I had 4 more days of my first week of vacation to take because I always take the first week off. And I just remember waking up and I checked the wind, and it was like a consistent 15-mile-an-hour wind. And at that point, something clicked in my head. I was like, wait a minute, with that wind blowing that hard, it's going to blow my thermals out of there before they have a chance to rise too much. And I can come in from the food source, like the direction of the food source. I had to circle around a little bit, but I can work my way back and get close to where that bed is. And that was that bed was the last bed that I found that summer. So it was really fresh in my mind, which I think helped a lot. So I parked my Jeep, started working my way in, and it was a very long process to get back in that hub. I actually saw 2 coyotes on the way in, and I was really close to shooting one, and I'm really glad I didn't now. But yep, exactly. And I kept working in, and right away, I mean, it wasn't 5 yards off the road, there was already buck sign. There was a scrape right by where I parked my Jeep. I couldn't believe it. But the whole way in, I was on good deer sign. And the only thing that kept me going was the fact that I had pre-scouted that and I knew where the beds were at, because at any point, I mean, there was good enough sign to really set up. If I wouldn't have had the pieces together where the actual bedding location was, I probably wouldn't have made it back as far as I did. So I kept working my way in, and I had some white oaks in mind. I checked the camera probably 150 yards from his specific bed, and that's when I had that 150-inch 10-point on camera. Beautiful deer, and I was like, yeah, I'll gladly take him. I actually had him in daylight walking from the bed to that scrape. So I had the specific bed that he was in it was like 3 days prior. I had him coming down off that bed right down the trail. So I got up on that trail and I decided I'm just going to continue to walk down the sign. And if I hit a really good scrape, I'm going to stop. But if I can make it to that white oak, I want to make it there. And it just so happened when I made it to that white oak, it was lit up with sign. There was a big scrape right there. There was a couple fresh rubs. I mean, the sign was there, and I knew how close I was to the bed. So I actually stood there for, I would say, the better part of 20 minutes trying to decide the specific tree I wanted to be in. And that was based on my thermals at that point for more than anything else. And I actually noticed that the wind was, as the velocity of the wind would change, it would swirl my wind a little bit, and I didn't want him to be able to smell me. So I decided to continue to move on a little bit further, which ended up being 33 yards total. And the reason for that was there was another cut in the mountainside. And I got right on the point of that cut, and my thermals pulled down a little bit more, and I decided that that's where I wanted to be set up. So I mean, it took me a long time to get my tree stand set up. I tried to go up in one trip. It didn't work. I had to go up in 2 trips. I finally got up and got set up, and I had a doe come off the ridge real early with a fawn. I was filming that, and then I was just filming B-roll. You know, it was a beautiful day out. It was blue skies and gorgeous. And so I had my camera in manual, and that's when I heard a stick crack. I looked up and I saw this deer stand up, and I knew it was a buck right away, but I didn't know obviously how big of a deer it was. And like I said, he started working kind of away from me, like towards the food source a little more. And I couldn't figure out why he missed that white oak, because I was like, he should have got up and came to that white oak. The reason for that is he wanted to be downwind of it first. So he left his bed, he went downwind of that white oak and came right back. And he was so focused on smelling that white oak that he never put his nose on the ground, smelled my ground scent at all. Whether that would have ruined the hunt or not, I don't know. I've never been a big believer of ground scent too much anyways, but he continued to work into that white oak, and he turned broadside. I swung my camera around as good as I could in manual, so I had it all messed up. Drew back. When I drew back, my string got caught on my camera, so I had to get my string off my camera, and he looked right at me, and I aimed and squeezed, and I hit him a little bit high and a little back, but I hit that big artery right at the bottom of the spine. And within, basically the aorta. And within 5 yards, I mean, his whole side was blood, and he jumped across the creek, and it sounded like a washing machine on the other side, kind of. I remember that. And then I heard like a step crash, and I knew he fell right there. And at the time, I was thinking he was a 160-inch deer. You know, he looked like a 160-inch frame coming in. And obviously, I got down, checked my arrow. I had really good lung blood. I went back up. I sat there for a while. I kind of did like a post interview that was still out of focus because I was so ramped up. And I didn't film any of like the tracking or anything because I can't even explain to you how fired up I was over this deer. I mean, I was just completely peaking. And I walked up on him, and I was just like, oh my God, I can't believe that the size of this thing and all the points all over the place and stuff. It's crazy, man. I mean, I sat up there. I lost my grandpa the year before, and I dedicated the previous hunting season to him. I didn't fill a tag because I was really focused on getting my exit deer that year. So I didn't fill my tag, and I really wanted to dedicate moving to Ohio to him. And I mean, I just sat up there and I actually kind of, just took everything in for a while and went out. I didn't have any service, so I had to drive almost a half hour to get service to call my buddy and my dad. And Ethan drove from Wheeling to actually, he met me before I was finished dragging that deer out because it was such a hard drag. And my brother and dad came down and we all celebrated. It was awesome. I just can't even explain it.
That's awesome, dude. My favorite part of that video is there's this like overwhelming excitement that you have going, yet you like there's this urgency of I've got to get out and get help to get this deer out of here, because you obviously don't want it to go bad, but you're trying to enjoy the moment. You're trying to do that thing, the thing that we all enjoy, which is to savor it. But you had to boogie out of there pretty quick, man. But you could see the excitement just all over your face. It was awesome.
Oh, that was, yeah. I get so ramped up over deer. I can't even. It's crazy, man.
Oh,
I
man,
love it.
That's too cool, dude. Well, what are you gonna do to push past what you managed to accomplish last year in only a couple months, dude?
So I've got the beat on quite a few good ones this year. I'm after a specific buck that I've got a bunch of them that I can target. I have backup plans, but day one, if I have the right wind, I've got a deer locked down pretty good. He's going to be right at that 170 mark as an 11. His G4 on the left side is only like probably an inch long. It might not even be at point, so he might be a typical 10 still, but he's just an absolute giant. I mean, I've got him on a community scrape coming off of Bedding Ridge, and he has been there at least 3 times a week since June in daylight.
Wow.
And that's on public. And he's also in there with at least one other 160 and a couple 150s, and then a bunch of just 3-year-old bucks. I mean, that whole system in there is loaded with deer right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got, that's kind of my game plan right now. I'm just trying to get my gear ready at this point. I'm trying to make sure I've got everything as quiet as possible. I actually have to go pick some milkweed because I ran out of milkweed. So I'm going to pick that and let it dry up for a couple weeks, and should be ready to go, man. It should be an awesome season. If I tag out here, I'm going to start doing some traveling around and try to hit some new spots and at least get a little bit of rut hunting in, because I don't have a lot of rut experience. So, but yeah, I'm thrilled, man. I'm ready for the season.
There's not a whole lot of big buck killers that can say that.
Yeah, I just very rarely have a tag, honestly.
Yeah.
And that's why the whole traveling thing's appealing to me a little bit more.
Sure.
I'd like to hunt more than a week a year. It'd help out quite a bit.
Sure. Yeah, man. Well, dude, I appreciate the heck out of you taking time out your evening to talk to us, and I have a feeling we're gonna have you back on, because I'm gonna be knuckleheaded and try and apply everything that you've said, and I'm probably gonna have to hit you up with like 100 new questions.
Oh, absolutely, man. Yeah, I'm all for it.
Why don't you tell everybody where they can find everything Jake Bush solo?
Yes, sir. So Instagram's going to be Jake_Bush_solo. I post a lot of hunting stuff on there for the most part. I've got a YouTube, which is Legends of the Hunt as well. And that's pretty much my 2 biggest platforms.
Right on, man. Right on. I'm going to close this out. Hang out with us for just a second longer.
Yes, sir. Sounds good.
All right, guys. Okay, guys. Do me a favor. Go show him some love. Follow him. Subscribe to him. Get the little bell notification going so that every time he drops a booner this year, you are the first person to know. But most importantly, no matter what you do, get outside and enjoy the great outdoors.